Welcome all, and thank you, Dr. Wood, for coming.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you everyone for being here, which for some of you is work time, and so I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days. And yeah, I can give just a little bit of a background about myself before I go into the talk. I'm a native Californian from the Bay Area. I did my undergrad work at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, lived in Hawaii for a while studying birds. Did a master's degree at Humboldt State University in wildlife before getting a PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And my interest in urban ecology actually started really in Madison, and in particular thinking about street trees. I'm a kind of a lifelong birder, and I would spend the spring and fall migrations in the city watching little warblers feeding in trees and just really wondering about, gosh, we create these ecosystems, these urban ecosystems, and thinking about ways that we could do that to also benefit wildlife. So following my PhD and doing a postdoc at Madison and also Colorado State University, and then another postdoc at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I was ecstatic to get a job in the CSU system where it all began for me and coming here to LA. And when I first arrived in Los Angeles, I always knew LA was famous for its urban forest, but I was really blown away by it, which that's become one of the main research interests for me. One more note before I get started, I'm trained as a wildlife ecologist, so I've spent over 20 years researching birds and wildlife in protected areas, and now with my current position at Cal State LA, I'm all about the urban ecosystem and doing some of those hardcore wildlife studies that you would do in a far off protected area, but doing those right in the middle of the city with the whole idea that how can we develop our cities that's going to benefit both people and wildlife as well? And so that's what I'm really interested in. And that's really what this talk gets into. And I'm going to share my screen. Richard, I think I need...
then you do need hosting privileges here. Yes.
Make host.
Should go now, I think.
Okay, yeah, I can do that now. So let me go ahead and share let me all know if you can see this. I hope you can.
Looks good.
Okay, so following that and following that introduction, thank you all for being here. I'm very excited that you're here. And I'm definitely going to talk about birds today, but I'm going to link that with our urban forest. And you can see the title of this talk, The Importance of Street Trees to Urban Avifauna. We have a paper that just came out about this, which some of you may or may not have seen. I'm going to highlight that later, but that's really what this talk is about, is highlighting the findings from that paper. And I do want to say that this is the very first research project in my lab at Cal State LA. The grad student who was a part of this is now a PhD student at UC Santa Barbara, doing very well, moving on. And we've just been building and building and building the lab to continue focusing on questions like this, which I'll come back to later in the talk. And the way I like to begin this talk is in thinking about urban ecosystems. I like to say, hey, look at this image right here, everyone, and just start thinking about some of the features of an urban area that could potentially benefit our birds. And some of that could be the topography, the ravines, the slopes. LA's got great topographical variation throughout the city. It could be the built-up environment. It could be downtown LA. It could be the asphalt areas that maybe are beneficial for some birds, definitely not so for others. Or it could be our urban forests. And I already talked about how LA is famous for this, and that's really what I want to focus on today. And thinking about that, and just a little bit of brief history here, our urban forest was definitely not always quite as extensive as it is today. This is an image of the San Gabriel Valley where I live. And when you're looking at this, this is the late 1800s. And when you're looking at this, this is typical of much of what greater LA looked like at that time. Arid, farmlands, not much of a developed urban canopy outside of orchards. And it's really important, and I stress this to students when I teach about this stuff, that we really need to be aware of the history of how Los Angeles has developed. Even think previous to this, when Native Americans were living in the area and using the landscape. There's been this transition that's been happening and happening and happening until, I'm going to zoom into this, until the early 1900s when water was diverted from the eastern Sierra Nevada. And then at that point, LA really, really, really took off. This is an image of the San Gabriel Valley. You can see Pasadena, Old Town Pasadena, the 210 freeway, those of you that are familiar with this area. And it's, of course, radically, almost 100% different from those photos that we were seeing earlier. You still notice some built up features, but you notice a lot of trees. And I've said this earlier, I'll say it again. When you look at all these trees, what you need to think of when you're thinking of Greater LA is that it boasts one of the most diverse and the most extensive in terms of the sheer numbers of trees, urban forests anywhere on the entire planet, which is something to actually be quite proud of, thinking that this wasn't here 100 years ago. So when you zoom in to this a little bit further, you start noticing things like this. And this is in Pasadena, where I used to live, don't live there anymore. But I was very struck by scenes like this when I first moved to Los Angeles. I felt like I was in the Northeast, where I was previously living, or the Midwest. And that was something that was actually interesting about many of the boom periods of LA from the early 1900s, post-World War II, to where we are now. Notice I'm not saying bust periods, just boom periods in terms of people moving here. In the early parts of the real development of Los Angeles, there were many city planners and developers moving to the region from the Northeast, the Midwest, places with a lot more water than we have here. And when you're moving to an area and you're thinking about developing it and you're promised abundant water and abundant sunshine like we had here, you could really go for it in terms of trying to develop an urban ecosystem that might resemble a wetter place. So with the street trees that you see here, LA was developed to have these really lush canopies, lush yards, similar to what you would find in areas not so much what you're thinking of for arid Southern California. And that was really interesting for me, and even more interesting for me when I used to drive and commute from Pasadena down to Cal State LA, where I work. I would go through some of the most affluent parts of Greater LA, San Marino, South Pasadena, just these places where you felt like you're in a tropical rainforest almost, driving down some streets. And then I'd get to Cal State LA and everything would change. And it was very, very obvious that, hey, there's some variation going on here that's not necessarily because of just natural conditions, it's what we created here. And I want to build on this a little bit more and start talking about some patterns about how the street tree canopy changes throughout LA. This is an aerial photo of a community right nearby Cal State LA, where many of my students that I teach are from. This is Willow Heights, and you can see high building density in this area. If you contrast that with a community, San Marino, which as the crow flies is not very far away, it looks quite different. When you get on the ground, it looks even more different. And so you start understanding this idea that there's really this idea of where the urban forest goes is kind of where the money is. And so there's this whole idea about socioeconomics and affluence that really starts driving patterns of our urban forests. And I found that fascinating because I've never lived anywhere. I've always lived in these kind of smaller college towns. I've never lived anywhere like Los Angeles where you just see that simply driving across the street. And that was something I really wanted to understand and study. To highlight this a little bit more, if you're looking at this gradient, the socioeconomic gradient from low to medium to high income areas like you'll see right here, it's very clear how the differences in the urban forest changes. And this is something that we know about. This is just looking at tree cover in LA from low to medium to high income areas. That's just the total tree cover canopy. This is something that we have a sense of in actually many cities in the world. There's this pattern that's going on. It's called the legacy effect. It's this idea that people who have the means to and money to withstand or to maintain vegetation on their properties will do so. And we were really interested in how that affected wildlife, and in particular how street trees, the variation of street trees across a socioeconomic gradient affected wildlife. So when we're thinking about this, and this is a question and just a link that I like to make for people when I say wildlife and linking this to birds. When I give talks or presentations or teach, and I'll ask people, hey, so you're thinking of wildlife in LA, that's awesome. What do you think of? And people say, oh, bears and coyotes and mountain lions and all this like awesome charismatic stuff that's in the city. And that's great. But what I always tell people is you gotta think about birds, because LA is quite literally famous for having birds that spend the winter months hanging out either in the city, along our coastlines and some of our bays, getting ready, just feeding, getting ready for the spring migration and then the breeding period. And in particular, we have birds like this Townsend's warbler you see right here, which are arboreal feeding, meaning up in the trees, migratory birds spending the winter down in Los Angeles. They're gonna migrate up in the springtime, and they really need to focus on feeding and making sure they're healthy during the winter months. You guys are all familiar with range maps, I assume, being from Audubon groups. You can see the blue areas, which is where this species will spend the winter, the orange area where they will migrate during this summer. So going back to this idea about wildlife in LA, I really urge everyone to be thinking about birds. And speaking to an Audubon group, that's not something that's going to really surprise anyone here. And so focusing on this a little bit more, there's some more motivations about why we should really care about our urban forest, how we manage it, how we manage our street trees, and biodiversity. So we do have a limited understanding of the value of our forest to migratory and resident birds. And what I mean by that is when you speak with urban foresters, they have such an extensive knowledge of how much water a tree needs, how much carbon a tree sequesters, what it's going to really take to manage and maintain a tree in a certain site, any given site. And it's fascinating speaking with people that have that knowledge base, but really throughout the world, we don't quite have this understanding about that tree species right there is going to provide these resources, this value to insects, to birds, to mammals, to other wildlife. And of course, we're going to be focusing on birds. This is important because as I've been talking about and alluding to with that idea from the Townsend's warbler that many migratory birds are not doing so well, they're in decline. And if they're going to be spending 6 months out of the year in our urban systems, we have a real opportunity to be thinking about conservation of biodiversity in urban areas. Urban ecology is this interesting quote, science where it's, of course it's science, but it's just a kind of new thing that people have been studying over the past 20 years or so, and thinking of our urban systems as these integrated ecological systems coupled with our natural systems. And so when we think, oh yeah, urban areas, that's where we live, we also have this responsibility to think of these places in terms of biodiversity that we support. And being an applied scientist, an applied ecologist, which is what I am, the idea there is I really want my work and our work to do something there. So our goal with our work is to make recommendations about trees that cities, residents, whoever, can use to promote wildlife conservation and hopefully urban functioning. And that gets back to that idea about beneficial for both people and both wildlife. And I think there's a way to be doing this stuff. Okay, so there's a couple research objectives that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. First, I'm going to go over all of our research about patterns of street trees and birds throughout LA. Where do you find the street trees? Where do you find the birds? And then I'm going to get into the foraging preferences of street trees by birds. And that's the idea that these birds really love feeding on these trees and they really avoid these other trees. There's over 100 species of trees that we sampled in our field work, so there's a lot of them. But if you think about it, there's only about 10 or so trees that are really seem to be valuable for our feeding birds, and I'm going to get to those. Okay, so how do we do a study like this? And when we're doing this, we want to think of studying all over greater Los Angeles. So I already talked about the socioeconomic gradient, and we did set up our study looking at surveys across the socioeconomic gradient. And you'll see that in these colors from light blue to that medium blue color to that darker blue color representing low to high. And you can see that throughout LA. We did a random sample of census blocks that fall into these groups to come up with our sampling design. And we came up originally with 60 sample locations, but we pared that down to 36 for various reasons throughout LA. At each one of these yellow dots, I'm going to highlight something else right here. At each one of these yellow dots, if you zoom in, you can see this is Cerritos. You can see an area where there's this gray line. That's a walking route where myself, the graduate student who's leading this project, or other students would walk, two people, one on one side of the street, one on the other side of the street, and look at all street trees that were along this whole area for feeding migratory birds or non-migratory birds. So when we did that, well, that's about 7,000 trees that we sampled for birds that were feeding in them. We also measured and identified all those trees throughout all these locations. And the reason why you do this is because you need to build a profile about what street trees are out there. This is just a sample of the population of greater Los Angeles in terms of the urban forest. And so you need to build a profile about which street trees are there and then what street trees are being used by the birds. And then you can do a bunch of different analyses with those types of data. And here's just a picture of some of the students who were out doing a survey. And this was loads of fun. We did this over 2 winters. So this was going from October through March, so more or less when a lot of those wintering migratory birds were in the area. And we visited each of these yellow dots twice in each winter, so 4 times in total. And for anyone, I think one of the biggest challenges with doing field work in Los Angeles, which is no surprise for any of us that live here, is getting up and sitting in traffic, rush hour traffic, to try to get to a field site early. You want to be out, of course, when the birds start being active, and so there's a lot of time sitting in traffic. Okay, so I want to jump into the results for the first part, this idea about street trees and bird relationships. Where can we find these yellow-rumped warblers around town? You know, we hear them all the time when we're just driving around, but really when you dig into the patterns of their density, where can we find that? And I'm going to go over a handful of graphs right now, and I'll just walk through what these graphs mean. And this is from this paper that just came out, and again, I'll go back to this one. So when we look at just sheer patterns of street tree density, this is just the number of street trees on our cityscape in our sample, very clear. You're starting seeing this pattern that when you go from low to medium to high, you're having more and more and more street trees. It just simply goes back to those observations that I was making about when you're driving from Pasadena all the way down to Cal State LA. It's kind of like you're driving right across this gradient here. What about size of street trees? Well, also the size of street trees, the basal area, and I'm not going to get into that, just think of size, far greater, far bigger in our affluent areas. And just simply looking at these bar charts right here, what you want to notice is just affluent areas have higher density and larger street trees. Okay, cool. That follows some of the other research that people have been doing all around the world, but we can confirm that for our street tree canopy here in Los Angeles as well. What about birds? Not focus on any relationships right now, but just their patterns throughout the city. Well, our migratory birds are also much denser in terms of the feeding migratory birds in the affluent areas. These numbers right here on the y-axis are actually how many we'd find in a kilometer of walking route. So about 10 or so of these different feeding birds in any place that we were going to. And what about our resident birds like this lesser goldfinch, one that we were studying? They're also much more denser in our affluent areas. And I should say, I neglected to mention this earlier, and I'll just say it right now. We were studying 10 bird species. So 5 migratory birds, yellow-rumped warbler, black-throated gray warbler, Townsend's warbler, orange-crowned warbler, and ruby-crowned kinglet. Those are the ones that are spending the winter here. And then we were studying 5, quote, resident birds, Allen's and Anna's hummingbirds. Some of their populations migrate, but we were considering them resident birds, lesser goldfinch, house finch, and bush tit. The reason why we were studying the resident birds is because they have different food needs, whether it's nectar, seeds, insects. And so we wanted to understand if you have birds with a variety of diets, do they use a variety of different trees? And so that was what we were going for. So whenever you see bird numbers, think of those 10 species. Okay, so affluent areas like the street trees, you're going to find more migratory and resident birds. And now the relationship part, some of the interesting statistics looking into this, and I'm going to go over 3 graphs here and I'll talk about each of them. When we simply look at what's driving the density of the migratory birds, if we just look at the number of street trees per kilometer, and what I want to highlight here, notice the colors. These are the colors that go back to the map that I was showing, light blue, medium blue, and dark blue. That represents low to medium to high income areas. Notice where the less street trees are right here on the left-hand side. And then you kind of find this interesting arc shape, and I'm going to talk about that when I show these graphs. But what I want you to notice is that with any increase in street trees, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if any increase in street trees, it's just a positive relationship in terms of the number of birds you're going to get feeding. It makes sense, especially because we're studying birds that like trees. So you have more trees in the landscape, more street trees, you're going to find more feeding birds. How about our resident birds? This is a graph that's also showing this interesting hump shape. Again, I'm going to get to that after I talk about the next graph. But the larger the tree, the more feeding birds you're going to get. And then the last one, we just look at all feeding birds together. These are all 10 species. It goes back to public street tree density. That's where you're really finding these feeding birds. So what's going on here? And just to decode this a little bit more, the big take home is that feeding birds are going to go where the trees are going to grow, or where they are planted and maintained. And what we think is happening, when you notice on the right-hand side, you're starting to see a lot of dark blue dots, more affluent zones. Why that dip in this line right here? What we think is happening is that as you get into more of our affluent zones, people have these yards that are just full of vegetation, and we think those are attracting birds away from the street trees. Remember, we're only looking at street trees here, not just total birds in these communities. Okay, so clearly, if we start doing things like putting more trees in parts of our city where we don't have them, these results certainly indicate that we're going to start doing some kind of benefit to our feeding birds. And so that's this idea here. If you have your friends come in from out of town and they say, boy, I'd really like to go see a black-throated gray warbler, where are you going to tell them to go when you go back to the Boyle Heights and the San Marino thing? Absolutely, you're going to go bum around San Marino and start looking for these birds because you're going to have a much higher chance of finding them in one of those areas. And remember what I said earlier about this. Yeah, San Marino is kind of in a hilly area, and there probably were some trees there, before people moved into this zone. But this is really something that we created here. And so that's really what's happening, is we're creating these conditions that are attracting certain birds. Okay, so the second objective of this talk, and what I want to get into, is this idea about foraging preferences for different birds. Which trees birds like and why. So looking at, say, one of our study species, the ruby-crowned kinglet, you can just see it looking for some insects on this little plant right here. I'm just going to highlight an image for everyone, and then I'm going to talk about our graph, and then I'm going to talk about what this graph actually means. So I was really interested in this idea about studying with native trees, native street trees are providing food resources. This is some evolution adaptive stuff for our native birds that are spending the winter here, or the exotic street trees, so the non-native street trees in our cityscape. And what I want you to notice right now is just look at the black bar. And so the y-axis on this graph right here is just simply looking at proportion. So if you stack the black bar together, the exotic and native street tree species, that's going to equal 100%. And so that's just simply saying the vast majority of street trees in Los Angeles are exotic or non-native. And we hardly have any that are native that are planted. And that's only in certain sections of the city. Think Claremont, think Pasadena, only a few sections. Most of it's all non-native stuff. So I say 5 species here, but it's really only 2 species. Coast live oak and California sycamore were the ones that we were seeing. Then if we go over to the exotic species, it's over 100 that we're surveying. So it's quite a lot. What you want to focus on from this graph now is the blue bar, and this is just the proportion of migratory birds that were feeding either on native or exotic trees. And then the green bar is the proportion of birds, resident birds that were feeding on native or exotic trees. And if these bars, the blue and the green, are higher than that black, it's indicating a preference, or showing some kind of a preference for those birds for native trees, meaning there's not that many native trees on the landscape, but they're looking for them. They're going after them and trying to find those to feed on them. Exotic trees, on the other hand, on the right-hand side, you still see tons of birds feeding on them, but it's because they're all over the place. That's what they have to feed on. And so there's actually an indication of avoidance for some of the exotic tree species because those bars are less than that black bar. And there's a lot more to this than this graph right here, but this is just the general pattern. So this is sort of a nod for our native plants and what they're doing for our urban birds. Let's get into this a little bit more. So this is a take-home. Migratory forest birds prefer some native trees, but they also will use some exotics. And that last point is really important when I get into the management implications of this talk. So which trees do birds prefer here? Notice on the left-hand side, there's a red vertical bar. To the left of that are our 2 native trees, California sycamore and coast live oak. And then to the right are a bunch of exotic trees. Read this graph the same way you'd read the other one. If those blue and green bars are higher than the black bar for a given tree, like a Chinese elm, it means they really prefer them. Same thing for California sycamore or coast live oak. So everything highlighted here, you'll notice some trees that are kind of grayed out. Everything highlighted here is a preferred tree, meaning birds are finding food on those. Coast live oak, California sycamore, carrotwood, Chinese elm, deodar cedar, some eucalyptus, holly oak, melaleuca, so on and so forth. Southern live oak. I have to minimize the screen here so I can see. Sweet gum and also southern live oak. And so I'm going to come back to the oaks in a little bit. Contrast that with, so 11 of 108 street trees preferred. 11. That's a very small percentage of street trees that are really important for our bird species. So 2 of those are native and 9 are exotic. All right, so what about trees that birds are avoiding? Well, right here, camphor, look at crepe myrtle. Crepe myrtle are everywhere, and we never would find birds feeding them, at least the birds we were studying. Indian laurel, fig, jacaranda, London plane tree. Mexican fan palm is interesting because the migratory birds really liked it, but our resident birds didn't so much. Southern magnolia is another one that's planted all over the city, and we simply just didn't see birds outside of parrots and a couple of species that we weren't part of our study that were using those. And then sweet gum, very important for our finch species, feeding on the seed capsules, but not so much for a yellow-rumped warbler trying to find some insects. So when we're thinking about this, you really start seeing these different patterns of these different trees. It's not just chaos when you go outside and you're starting to go birding and saying, oh, any tree out there is going to harbor bird species that I'm interested in. It's very particular ones. And of course, that's probably up to some of the food that they're providing. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So 97 of the 108 street tree species that we surveyed were avoided. That's a huge proportion of those. 3 of those were native, though those were extremely uncommon. That was an Engelmann oak and an alder and a willow species, or sorry, not willow, but a black walnut. And they were just so uncommon that we couldn't really ascertain their value. And then 94 were exotic. A lot of those were also quite uncommon. We had only come across 1 or 2 individuals through all of our surveys. So when you start seeing these very clear patterns about some trees that birds are preferring to feed on and some they're not, you just got to ask that question, why some and not the others? And this is something that we talk about a lot in my lab. And so there's 2 hypotheses or 2 reasons that I'm going to talk about. One is food accessibility. So there's this thing, people have tested this, I've tested this, I'm going to show some data on this in a previous study, but trees with shorter leaf petioles tend to be easier access to food. And if you think about a coast live oak here, if you're a bird like a Townsend's warbler and you land on a branch right here and you just look up, there's leaves everywhere. The petiole are the little short piece of this leaf right here that's attaching the leaf to the branch. And if you have a short little petiole, that leaf is going to be very close, hopefully for a bird that's going to be perched on one of these branches looking for food. And so if there's a caterpillar, a spider, some other insect under there, they should be able to find that pretty easily. And I mentioned that I looked at this before. This is for migrant warblers in Wisconsin during the spring. And when we're looking at foraging success, this is just a ratio of how much a bird is feeding to looking for food, with a white ash being like primo food tree for these birds. Whereas a maple is a species that has much lower foraging success. If you look at foraging success in relation to leaf petiole length, how big the leaves are, you notice this negative correlation where birds are gonna, especially these migratory birds, are gonna say, hey, you know what, I'm gonna hang out on white ash, elm species, white oak, paper birch, so on and so forth. That's where I'm gonna have easier access to find some food. And this comes down to this kind of theory that's been around for a long time about optimal foraging by birds, and that's this idea that birds are going to forage in a way to maximize their caloric intake while also minimizing their risk. And if you're a migratory bird that's flying 200 or 300 miles a night, you don't have a lot of energy to spend during the day, so you're going to feed on trees where it's going to be easier for you to access food. So the question is, well, do we find support for this food accessibility hypothesis with LA's street trees? Here's a picture of coast live oak. That's just my hand right there. Nice short little petiole. But then what about California sycamore? You know, when you look at this right here and it has that big giant petiole and you think, oh, I don't think that there's much there to that food accessibility hypothesis, because obviously this is a monster leaf, that's a monster petiole. If there's a caterpillar out here and a bird really wants it, it has no choice but to fly out and pick that up. Okay. So we don't know if there's much there. So what's the other thing we're thinking of? And it's this idea about food availability, the amount of food that a certain tree is going to provide to a bird. And this is something I also was looking at in my PhD, using some data from Doug Tallamy and colleagues, and with the number of caterpillars per tree. And if you look at foraging success of migrant warblers in Wisconsin and correlate that with total caterpillars per tree, there's a positive relationship here. You look at our oak species, our birch species, tree species that have lots of caterpillars, we tended to find birds had a higher foraging success on those. And so when we think, okay, food availability, there's got to be something here. Do we find support for food availability hypothesis with I think someone's microphone might be unmuted. So do we find support for this with LA street trees? And I know this is a black-throated green warbler. This is just a picture I took in Wisconsin, not a bird we'd find here, but he'll give you the same question mark as a bird out here. We just simply don't know what insects, we have a better idea about fruits and seeds that trees are going to provide, but we simply don't know what insect prey our trees are going to provide to our birds. And that's something we really want to figure out. So we're more or less done with the street tree research we were talking about. The paper's published, but we were working on a bunch of other things, and I'm going to highlight some of the projects we're working on now. But when we're thinking about the next steps for urban forest research, we did notice that some of these exotic or non-native trees were quite important for some of our birds. And so we're just wondering, what resources do some of these exotic trees offer to birds in our cities? And before anyone gets upset about me going after the question, I'm a native plant person. We have native plants in our yard, and we're all about that, my wife and I. So, sorry, I don't think that's on my side, but wherever that noise is coming from. And so we were really interested in studying this because we want to have a better idea about when you look across the urban forest, if we could just pinpoint these trees tend to provide lots of food resources for birds and these others don't. We think that's something that would be really beneficial. And what do I mean by this? So when you look at this image, there's two different tree species right here, one on the left and one on the right. And if we were all sitting here in person, I would stop and wait and ask everyone, like, what differences do you notice in this tree species besides the shade and the sun? Did the leaves look more or less the same size and shape? Did the branching architecture look more or less the same size and shape? What, did they look similar to one another? And when you're looking at any of the differences between the two, to my eye, they look somewhat similar. And when you're looking at these, one's a coast live oak and one's a southern live oak. And so these are trees that are from very different parts of the world. One's an endemic California species on the left, and one is from the southern parts of the United States. It's planted quite commonly around LA. If you're a bird and you're feeding on this coast live oak and you're finding a bunch of food and you say, okay, well, it's time for me to go over to the southern live oak, and it visually might look similar to you, you don't care where it's really from. You don't care about its geographic origin, just as long as you're able to find the food that you need in a way that you're going to be efficient in finding that too. And so highlighting this a little bit more, here's a map of coast live oak, one of our endemic trees, and southern live oak. And so there's this question here, this somewhat of an evolutionary question about thinking of adaptability of our endemic trees to the native insect wildlife, and then something that's been planted from another part of the world that possibly, we don't know, but possibly might not support the same numbers of insects and possibly might not support the same food web that something like a native tree could. When you look at the leaves of these, they look pretty similar, coast live oak versus southern live oak. And when you go back to this idea about some of the preferred oak trees, or some of the preferred trees, definitely our native coast live oak, but also holly oak and southern live oak are there as well. So we are curious about this and we want to try to understand this a little bit more. There's very much an academic side to this, but there's also a kind of a conservation application side of this that I'll talk about. So how are we doing this? Well, currently right now, the city of LA is trimming their trees like crazy, doing a ton of work to manage a lot of trees because there's been sort of a backlog on this maintenance work over the past 10 or 15 years from what I understand from folks that are doing this. And so we really just started getting this off the ground and then COVID hit. So this is all more or less on hold. But the idea is to go out and work with the street tree trimming crews and gather branches that they're cutting, bring them back to the lab, sort through all the leaves and figure out which insects are on different trees and couple that with a lot of the bird feeding patterns that we're noticing. And so when we're thinking about this, and this is more for the folks that are in this, who are on the academic side, this is a functional ecology question that does have some urban conservation implications. And by functional ecology, what I mean are some of these exotic trees that we're really noticing, especially these oaks, that we're really noticing birds tend to really feed on well, are they functionally similar to our native species? So we're focusing on this question on 1 native and 3 exotic oaks. This is all on hold right now because of COVID, but we're just ready to go for this. Most of our work is in the San Gabriel Valley because that's where a lot of our oaks are in Pasadena, insect trapping, bird foraging. We're doing some exclosure experiments. And I say starting next fall, that was supposed to be this past fall. And as we've been working on this, COVID. And so we all have our stories about what that's doing for our field research, but it's definitely impacting some of what we're doing. But really what I'm interested in is I'm very interested in this idea about urban food webs and what vegetation we have in our urban areas, what that does for just an ecosystem functioning. Lots of famous work from Doug Tallamy's lab about native plants and what that does for insects and birds. We're doing something pretty similar here in LA, also with looking at our native and non-native plants. All right, so what are some of the take-homes from this research? So going back to some of the big things we talked about, keep this in mind. Our affluent areas for sure have higher density and larger trees and also more feeding birds. Feeding birds are very positively, highly associated with higher density and larger street trees. And some of our native trees, only 2 of them, but they are definitely preferred by some of these birds for feeding, but some exotics are beneficial as well. And when you're taking this all together, you're digesting all this information, you say, okay, well, I have a place for a street tree in my front yard. What what do I plant there? Or I work for a city, and what does this guy tell me I should plant here? And I'm under no illusion how complicated it is to think about what to plant. These are simply just patterns about which birds tend to feed in some of our trees. So what do we say for some of the conservation and management applications of our work? Given our research, these are, and considering our research, this is what we say. We definitely encourage street tree plantings and maintenance, especially, I say just that word disadvantage, but lower income communities. And this is a pattern not just here in Los Angeles, but elsewhere. The city of LA and you know, communicate and have colleagues and friends that work on these issues, they definitely know about this and have been working on this for quite some time. So it's not necessarily a mystery, but it's something that if we're thinking about a resilient urban canopy in the future, we're thinking about climate mitigation, we have to kind of spread it out a little bit more for where we're planting some of our trees. And also, given the state of the world right now, I think it's worth it for all of us to be thinking about this. This is absolutely an equity issue as well, too, when we're thinking of this. And it's not right just to have trees in very wealthy parts of certain cities. This is something that we think, especially because these are public resources, we should be thinking about how these are spread throughout. So this is a very hard one, but something that's important in terms of incentives for homeowners or landlords to maintain street trees. And something that's difficult about this is in certain parts of a city where many of the units are not owner occupied, maybe they're rentals, there's definitely less of an incentive to say, hey, I'm gonna keep that street tree alive. For those of you that are homeowners, you know this, that the street tree is public property, but it's up to you to keep that thing alive, or at least that's the general idea with it. So watering, trim in the branches, whatever you need to do for that thing to make sure it's going. Yes, every once in a while, the city may come in and help out and do some stuff, but it's really on you. And so if you don't have much of an incentive to do this, that's tough. And so the idea about incentivizing this, incentivizing the maintenance and care of street trees is something that's really important. And then we do say consider native trees, but be mindful of certain planting strategies that have not worked in the past across this country, very famous examples. Think of the Northeast and the Midwest that lined streets with elm trees back and forth, and then something like Dutch elm disease comes in and just decimates the tree canopy. Think about what's going on in the Midwest right now with emerald ash borer beetle. There's ash trees, just the same tree, ash trees lining streets, and they're just being decimated by pests. And that's a big time problem here in Southern California too. We have the polyphagous shot-hole borer beetle, which is infesting many, many, many trees. We have the gold-spotted oak borer beetle, which infests coast live oak trees. Those are more in our protected areas, but that pest can easily come down in the city. Our palm trees are having a problem with weevils right now. And so we really, you know, have to be mindful of say, hey, California sycamore and coast live oak are really good for our birds, but it's probably not the wisest thing to plant them all throughout the city everywhere if we're thinking about resilience of an urban forest. And that's where it comes back to this idea that in an arid place like Los Angeles, where you do not have tree diversity that's very high in valley areas for trees that are native trees that are going to grow really well in a city, you probably have to think about some non-native species, non-native trees for some of our street trees. And our research says, gosh, if you're going to do that, there's so many of them that seem to be extremely poor habitat for wildlife. So if you got to do that, our research says just consider a few of these that potentially might provide some benefits. Because remember, going back to the bird thing, their populations are going down. We have a responsibility for thinking about conservation for them. So this research is just out. And here's the title of the paper right here. And I can share this with Marianne and Richard, and maybe they can send this to the group. But it's this idea, this paper called The Importance of Street Trees to Urban Avifauna. And I wrote this in a way, along with Saban, the grad student on this project, to hopefully be accessible to everyone. There's statistics and all that academic stuff in there, but we wrote this in a way where we could just give it to someone who's interested in urban forestry. And hopefully there could be, you know, some things learned here in this paper. So again, I'll send this to Marianne and Richard and Paula, and maybe they can share this with the group because it's a free access paper. Anybody can download it.
So
okay.
If I could, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Richard, go ahead.
I was going to say that in the invitation for this presentation that we sent out from San Fernando Valley Audubon, there is a link that will take you directly to this paper. I know that link got stripped out by some of the subsequent people who were sub-inviting. So I think you will find it on the website for the San Fernando Valley Audubon Society, but I'll check and make sure that's the case with Jim Houghton, who's responsible for maintaining that.
Perfect. Thanks, Richard, for that. And anybody can just email me if they want. If you just type in Eric Wood into Google, you're going to see a big football player from the Buffalo Bills. And so you got to type in Eric Wood bird, and then it'll show up. But you can find my email address. I'm hopefully not that hard to find, and I'd be glad to furnish you a copy if you would like one. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit more about some of the current other projects. Remember, this is just one project, the street tree thing. There's been 10 grad students in the lab so far, so 9 other projects, and some of those with really exciting results. And I'm going to share a couple of those right now, just some of the other urban projects we have. So a grad student, Amy Vasquez, is just wrapping up her thesis. She's probably going to defend within the next few weeks here. She's going on to a PhD at Johns Hopkins after this, and she was working about biodiversity in LA's urban parks with this goal to understand the potential of our urban parks as bird habitat. And we did that from understanding features within parks, different types of trees, kind of a follow-up from the street tree work, to also thinking about our surrounding cityscape and what that also does in terms of thinking about park biodiversity. Here's a park you can see in Pasadena. And when we're looking at parks, just got these red boxes here highlighting. When you're looking at these, and this is another point where if we were all in person, we would just sit here and have a discussion about this. But besides the size of the parks, what can we see? Possibly building density around the parks might change. Tree density might change. There might be some industrial zones that you can see. And so the way we build our cityscape, absolutely, as we just learned in the last research, absolutely has an effect on our biodiversity. And so we were curious about biodiversity in our parks and how that changes throughout the city. And we were also thinking about socioeconomics with this research. So here's a park in a lower income part of LA, and then you could see one down in a higher income part of the LA, maybe more tree cover in the higher income part. So LA is working very hard to start putting in parks in more parts of the city that are park poor. And we want to be a part of that in terms of thinking about, well, here's some ways you can potentially think of parks in terms of biodiversity. I don't want to digest this figure too much, but we were just interested in 2 spatial extents in our park, measuring all the trees and counting all the birds in the parks. That's within the park. What do we do within our parks that influences wildlife, and then also the surrounding the surrounding urban scape. And so that's some remote sensing work that we were doing. And I want to highlight, this is for the academic people, again, this is a landscape ecology type study. So Amy was surveying parks all over the city. Here's a distribution of her parks, and she just collected an unbelievably cool data set. So many bird counts, measuring trees at all the different parks. And I just want to highlight a couple things that I'm really excited. This is like hot off the presses for her thesis. So when we're thinking about forest and woodland birds in LA's urban parks, I'm going to share a couple patterns here. Park size is definitely important when we're thinking about how to attract some forest birds to some of our parks. If you look within parks, the amount of impervious surface, whether it's concrete, ball fields, that's negatively related. We got to have ball fields and basketball courts, of course. We're not saying don't do that, but just some patterns here. And then also when we're looking at the surrounding urban landscape, there's the more impervious surface you have surrounding parks, that's also negatively related with forest birds that you might find in parks. Contrast that with some urban birds like this house finch right here. Urban birds in our LA's urban parks. So there's a positive there that the further you are from distance to protected areas, Sierra Mountains, you're going to have more urban birds in your parks. That makes sense. Within a park, the more bare ground you're going to have, again, ball fields and open areas, you're going to have more species like this house finch. And then also surrounding the city, the more bare ground you're going to have, the positive correlation with house finches. This is an opposite from what we were seeing before. And what this research suggests to us is that how we manage the general surrounding cityscape is also going to influence, just in general, biodiversity that not only we're going to find in parks, but just throughout the city in general. I can't wait for these data to be out there, and I'll share all this stuff with the group whenever this stuff is published. Another student, Noriko Smallwood, some of you are already familiar with her because she's probably working in your yard. Well, we can't right now with COVID, but we are working on quantifying biodiversity in urban private yards, both front and backyards. And this is really important because when we're thinking about biodiversity in a city, the vast majority of that's going to occur in private yards, which is the vast majority of the lands. throughout a city. And so we're working with willing homeowners to study differences between native landscape yards and yards that are more traditional, I'd say like suburbia landscape, lawns and hedges. And COVID is just put this project on hold right now, but we're really excited to get out there and start understanding both insects and birds in different parts. If you're interested in being a part of this study, and if you have native plants in your yard, please contact me because we would love to talk with you and potentially work with you. Here's our distribution of yards right now. I do not recall what the pink and yellow dots are, but nevertheless, here's where we're working. Again, it's all over in Orange County and LA County. And I think even getting out into Riverside County a little bit. Okay, and so the last project I'm going to talk about in collaboration with LA Urban Center and the US Forest Service, we're working on a study where we're using LiDAR, which is this kind of cool image you see down here. For those that are not familiar with LiDAR, LiDAR is, there's a lot of different applications for this, but city planners, biologists use LiDAR that's flown on planes where there's a sensor below the plane shooting laser pulses down at a very high frequency. And you can characterize structural components of cities, whether it's trees, buildings, I'm not sure what all this is in this image, but nevertheless, you can really get a kind of a 3D understanding about what a city looks like. And of course, if we're interested in trees, this is a great way to quantify trees across the landscape. So Christian Benitez is working on this project, and he's counting birds throughout the city, using these LiDAR data and relating LiDAR and a bunch of other things that he's measuring to test various hypotheses about what's most important for birds in the cities: the vegetation structure, the architecture of the trees. Is it the composition of the trees, whether it's an oak, a sycamore, or some other type of species? Is it the variability in landscape heterogeneity across the city? What is that? And really, our goal here is to explain bird distribution patterns across the city, map those distributions. And again, this generally goes into this idea about thinking about biodiversity in the city and eventual conservation applications. As I was talking about, it's super difficult to do this on private lands because so much of the, you can't just waltz into someone's yard, but using remote sensing data enables a way to get at this goal. Okay, so I'm probably almost done with time, so I'm gonna go through these last few projects fairly quickly just to talk about a few more things. So grad student Austin Hsu has been working in the Santa Monica Mountains, studying the effects of the Woolsey fire on birds, butterflies, and herpetofauna. And I just want to highlight that we weren't studying the Woolsey fire at all. We were surveying birds at all these locations, and then the fire burned right through the middle of this. And for those of you that live in the San Fernando Valley, you know exactly where the fire scar of this fire was. And so there's a lot of research in here, but just a kind of a quick snapshot. How do shrub birds respond to a fire of this magnitude, especially given that so much chaparral burned? Well, it's pretty obvious that if you look before in the blue area, these are the same locations sampled before and after fire. There's just a dramatic decrease in the number of these shrub birds that we're finding. Why? Because chaparral birds, they didn't have their habitat anymore. Interestingly enough, on the other side, butterfly abundance really kind of took off between the 2 years before and after. And a lot of that was because it rained so hard in between these 2 years. There's a lot of black mustard and a lot of growth that was affecting different species. And last, Peter Laramendi, who's finishing this summer, he's been studying birds in the Channel Islands using a data set over the past roughly 20 years and trying to understand climate variability and how that's affecting birds on the smaller islands, Santa Barbara, Anacapa, to the bigger islands. Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, and San Miguel. It's just a distribution of points in terms of where he was surveying on San Miguel Island. So with that, I know I went through those last ones kind of quick, but this was a talk about street trees and birds, and I hope you gained information about what I was talking about earlier. And with that, I will take any questions.
So Eric,
Hi.
to take your questions verbally, or you want to take them as chat questions? There's a lot of people. We have over 90 people tuned in, and it's if you get everybody turning off their mute, then you get a lot of static. So
I think if you could just maybe take some questions in a chat, that might be better. I think with this many people, it might be difficult doing that.
Okay. I saw one question came up early on in the talk, which was actually kind of defining what a street tree is. It sounds like there's some distance between the tree and the street, and maybe a fence going into the backyard. It wasn't clear exactly what you meant by street tree, and kind of a corollary, my own question on that is, you know, given the paucity of native tree species, I would think that maybe shrubs like toyon or something like that might be a much more important food source than trees, because you know there just aren't that many species of trees and they aren't that dense. So
yeah, thanks for the good questions, Richard, and I'll answer both. And yeah, and thanks for pointing out this idea about what is a street tree. And so I'm just going to go back and look at this image. Street trees are planted in public rights of way. And so that could be this little strip that you notice right here on the left-hand side between the sidewalk and then the private property. And again, this is public right here, this area, but it is the responsibility, as far as everything I know and conversations I've had, of the homeowner or the owner of the land to keep those trees alive. So street trees, think of these strips right here. There are plenty of sections in town where there wasn't a sidewalk strip like this, where all of a sudden there were just trees grading into people's yards, and we just left those alone because we didn't know, you know, what to count those. But I hope that helps in terms of thinking about what an actual street tree is. Okay, so Richard, your question is a good one, and that's just thinking about our shrubs. And I can just say from my experience that, let me back up. The reason why we studied street trees to start was simply because we could. We could walk along a sidewalk and look up and actually really start understanding quite a bit about our urban forests this way. And that goes to this other thing that we couldn't really be surveying in people's yards. And going along streets like this, we didn't come across things like toyon and laurel sumac, some of these nice shrub species that people have planted in their yard, because again, it was in people's yards. We're really hoping to get at that.
I could
read those questions. So with thinking of current projects that we're doing, that's absolutely what we're trying to understand, Richard, is the value of our shrub community, which I really think with biodiversity, if we were planting more some of you know, these coastal sage species or chaparral species that were adapted to growing in this climate throughout certain parts of the city where we could do this, I think we could really make an impact for birds and other insects and so on and so forth.
Okay, we have a question from Mark Elsakal about studying the life history stage of the trees. You know, it's over time, there's fruiting, there's flowering, there's setting seed. Does your study get into any of that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for that. We, over the 6 months of our survey periods, roughly during the wintertime, all sorts of phenophases, meaning different types of growth stages for the different trees, whether they were winter deciduous, losing their leaves, whether they were flowering, whether they were having some kind of seed set. And for every single tree that we monitored bird feeding, we would do a phenology assessment too, and also indicate which food resource the birds were feeding on. Interestingly enough, when we did analysis on this, and this is very different from my PhD, I did a ton of work on phenology and climate change with migrant birds for my PhD. Interestingly enough, we would of course notice patterns like when an American sweet gum had seed capsules on it that finches would be all over it feeding. Of course we would notice this, but it was difficult to track for the migratory birds exactly which type of phenology stage they were on in certain trees. Flowering of oaks is a big one, because when you have those catkins hanging down, you tend to find little caterpillars and different insects in those flowers. So that's always a big one, and that's a classic one. But we didn't really find too many other patterns for that, but we're interested in it. I think it's a great thing to be thinking about.
Okay, Mark had a follow-on question, and he was asking about lack of stratification for street trees that he says confounds usage information. There may also be elevational gradient effects. How do you control for this stuff?
It's very difficult to control for all of this stuff because there's a lot of confounding variables. You could be in certain sections of the city that are cooler, hotter, that are watered more, that might influence growth stages, insect communities. There might be certain trees that are overrun with pests that birds are feeding on that we just couldn't really quantify. So those are all quite difficult questions in terms of stratification, thinking of the structure of the trees and how that varies from low to high, whether certain trees are taller, certain trees are less. very difficult stuff. And so as with any wildlife study, we followed very strict protocols in terms of how we were collecting data and which types of data we were collecting. I will say the stratification issue was very difficult, and I'm just thinking of tree height here. I'm hoping that's what the question is getting at. Was extremely difficult for Canary Island pine, and there's a few other trees where we just almost gave up trying to actually follow birds and their feeding behavior. And we talk about that in the paper, that there was just some trees that we just didn't feel comfortable enough collecting data in due to how challenging it was. But absolutely no doubt, over an area as big as Los Angeles, greater LA, there's huge diversity of conditions that could influence how birds are behaving, how trees are growing. And with a study like this, you simply just do your best to try to make sure you have a good random sample of the entire population, so you're hopefully getting enough data to overrule some of those confounding variables. But it's a great question, and it's there in every wildlife study in terms of trying to think about those things.
Okay, we have kind of a similar analytic question from John Rowden. He says, could you analyze preference for exotic tree species when there were also native tree species present? So if Chinese elm and California sycamore are present in similar proportions as part of a matrix with other species, would there still be that preference for Chinese elm? Sample size might not allow for that.
Yeah, we actually, this is a great question too. To truly get a preference in this kind of a way, you need trees in similar proportions. And that's what you have to do to really get at something like this. And that's just not feasible in a study like this. In an experiment, if we were on some experimental farm or in a nursery that was growing things, we could get at that. But that's just simply something we couldn't do. So imagine a street like this image right here. There might be 1 or 2 California sycamores, and there might be 20 Chinese elm. And so you would have, of course, a lot more Chinese elm that were available to feeding birds, and that might attract them more. If that were flipped, you had 2 Chinese elm and then 20 California sycamore, maybe proportionally that would also influence their use patterns. And that's something that we had to be very careful with in the paper, with indicating that really, what I use that word preference, that's a strong word in wildlife sciences in terms of saying, yeah, we know that these animals prefer these and not those. We couldn't do that because we didn't have equal proportions. And I think that's actually an astute observation to point that one out. What we get at is this idea that indicates preference or indicates use, because our study was totally observational, not experimental.
Okay, different kind of question here from Monty Lamont. He asks, or she asks, do you accept volunteers without a science background?
Of course we do.
I think you've told them.
Of course we do. For example, right now, I can go back to Noriko Smallwood's project. She's the young woman working in, the grad student working in people's yards right now, and she's recruited a lot of people to collect data for her because she simply can't go to their yards right now, and they're very interested in doing that. When we've done surveys in the past, we do a lot of outreach work, Christmas bird counts and all that, and we have people often ask, hey, how can we be a part of your research? Contact me, and I'd be happy to talk about that, because we do have a lot of stuff going on all throughout the city.
Great. Let's see. Also, this is a person who lists themselves as Tuchis. Thank you, Eric. Will you also study the effect of LED and fluorescent lighting on birds? We're trying to make our property a wildlife habitat and light our house with red and orange lights. Also, do those exotic trees you recommend have root issues with houses?
I can answer the last question. I don't know. And I wish I knew more about some of those types of forestry questions. I'm sure there's folks on the call right now that really know that, and I'm sure it's species specific too. To get at the first question about lighting and what you could do, absolutely, light pollution has a strong effect on wildlife, and that's something that quite a few studies are showing throughout the world right now. And so if there are ways to make your house, I don't know what kind of lights people could use or kind of shade over time, that there's evidence there that could potentially benefit some of our wildlife. I will tell you that the study we were trying to do in the Santa Monica Mountains before the Woolsey fire came through was studying the effects of light and sound pollution from the surrounding city on birds and herpetofauna and butterflies also in the protected area. So we might try to look at that more, but absolutely light pollution, sound pollution, they're a big deal. It's very difficult to manage that stuff in the middle of a city because you could do something for your house, but what is everyone else doing around you? That's gonna also have an effect as well. So if you can convince your entire neighborhood, you might be able to do something there.
Okay.
There was a question about the availability of the recording of this talk, and we will post that on the San Fernando Valley Audubon Society webpage.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm glad this was recorded, and yeah, please spread the word about this. This idea of biodiversity in urban ecosystems, I'm going to go back to one of the first points I said. This really resonates, and it resonates with me, and clearly, you know, with the turnout here that we have in our talk. We all really want to think about our cities and improving them for us, but definitely for biodiversity. And so please use this information if you can. Please reach out to me if you have further questions, and please share the talk if that's made available, like on YouTube or whatever it is.
As I recall, Eric, you're very open to helping with neighborhood councils and other elected officials who are having to grapple with this kind of stuff. They can call you and get you to sort of testify.
We are, I will say, we've gotten a little bit involved in some, you know, some things where, you know, we want our data, and I'll just say this, we want our data I come at this as like a total scientist. We do our studies and then we share the science. We're very careful with how we follow all of our protocols. And then we offer recommendations for what we think, but we don't necessarily advocate for the point of saying it should be this way, it should be that way. But we provide so much data that I'm hoping that people can kind of come to those points on their own. So if it comes up to city councils or you know, anything like that, point them to these data, these paper, this talk, and if it comes down to it, definitely, you know, we'd be happy to consider and think about talking about it. I will say that I'm going to be hopefully on the environmental review board for the county in terms of making recommendations for larger projects, and so hopefully some of that stuff can also filter down towards neighborhoods and really the places where we're living.
Joanne D'Antonio, of course, has also added, because this is her area of expertise, the city of Los Angeles is working on their street tree planting list. Yeah. She's asked, would you want to make a short list of best trees for birds here? And then she says, we have the ear of the city forest officer. What have you done of any study of what over pruning affects birds? The city of LA does not allow trees to arch over streets, like your lovely Pasadena picture.
Yeah, can you imagine this, parking your car under one of those trees and just hoping something doesn't fall on you? Well, to answer those questions, yes, we would be very happy to provide lists and recommendations of trees that we, based on our research, that these birds are very much using. They're right there in the paper, but also in the slides for this talk, would be happy to share that with others. We haven't done anything with pruning and cutting trees here, but I will say that in a lot of cities and neighborhoods think about these things in terms of nesting birds and when different times of the year when it's appropriate to prune. It's very difficult because there always seems to be something to consider when doing that. And I guess I'll just leave it as we haven't studied that. We'd actually be pretty interested in studying that, given especially that the city of LA is doing so much work on this right now. It's very important work for people to be doing this, but then also, yeah, I mean, there could be some kind of effects on wildlife, and if anyone wants to talk more about that, please contact me.
Right. Muriel Coton asks, have you studied any affluent high density neighborhoods?
I mean, no, I don't think so. I think most of we were totally focused in residential areas, and I would say that, you know, we were in Beverly Hills, we were in upscale parts of Santa Monica, we were in San Marino, we were in the kind of the classic affluent sort of suburb residential areas of LA, but we weren't, say, like in downtown LA and maybe like expensive locations of downtown LA, but I absolutely think that needs to happen. We focused on residential areas in particular because we wanted scenes like this, or that could be like this, where we had sidewalks, where you had the right of way. Of course, you can get that in places like downtown LA in certain areas, but we just didn't study in those. Someone's got to do it. It's super important.
Okay. Mark Osako asks also no mention of water proximity. Any info about that?
Super important. I don't have much information about that because I'm certainly not an expert with it in terms of whether it's water, in terms of people providing water. I don't quite understand. I'm not sure I quite understand what water proximity means, close to the ocean, or what that means there. But in terms of watering, I think it's sort of a pattern, the affluence pattern a little bit. And we didn't study it, so I don't want to say too much about that, but it's certainly something that's important. I have had conversations with folks at the city who really know a lot about this stuff, and it does sound like the soil and soil compaction, hopefully I'm getting that right, and water are some of the two biggest issues, or some of the two biggest considerations, I guess I should say, in terms of foresters and thinking of what they can plant. And gosh, it's just like I've said, it must be so complex thinking about what you can put on a street like this and knowing that it's going to do well. We have a lot of trees that over time people have tried to plant places and they just didn't do well for one reason or the other. And it could come back to those two factors.
Okay. Shelley Billick asks, in your opinion, what cities do a good job of balancing biodiversity with risk management and city maintenance goals, trimming, etc.?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to, favor some over others, but I will say that when we were out doing our surveys, there's definitely places where you're walking around and you just kind of get the sunset. Like this was a really well thought out or well designed street, or this location of this neighborhood, it's a little funky, but then when you go over here, for some reason, things kind of change. And so I don't want to point fingers at any of the municipalities in LA, because there's a lot of places that are really doing an excellent job. I could just go back to my first home in Pasadena, and I thought it was kind of unbelievable what that city was doing in terms of its management of its urban forest. So that was really the only one that I was intimately familiar with. But yeah, there's some places in Los Angeles, and I'll just say this. Beverly Hills is one that was interesting for us because there's a lot of street trees in Beverly Hills. It's a lot of the same species. And so really kind of actually low diversity, but really high density of street trees. And it's one of the only places where we were noticing that. And there was definitely a lot of birds when we would be walking around that location, definitely a lot of birds in that area. And it's probably has to do with the whole thing that people have these really lush yards that could attract and support a lot of wildlife. But yeah, there's a lot of places in LA that are doing an awesome job, and Claremont, Pasadena, so on and so forth.
Okay, we have a comment from Andy Rivoli, and that is, a lot of people where I live and myself have fruit trees and or plants that produce food. Any tips on these?
Yeah, so my wife and I, we love our fruit trees in our backyard, and like a lot of Angelinos and people in the Southland, it's one of the great things about living here is you can grow so many different types of fruits. And in terms of fruit that maybe you don't want a bird eating, or maybe you do want to support them, we've tried something where our front yard, this is just personal experience stuff, so take this or leave it. I don't know if it's valuable. We decided to make our front yard native plants and kind of convert it to almost sort of coastal sage conditions, and then our backyard more the edible plants, the fruit plants. And we kind of did it a little bit for those reasons. We're a little worried about some of the trees getting munched on by some of the birds. We have an apple tree in our front yard, and the mockingbirds are always in there. And so I don't know what to say about fruit trees. If you grow some yummy fruit for us, there's probably some other animals that are going to think it's yummy as well.
Okay. Also another comment from Mark. Just thought he would mention Recon Parks clears underbrush in parks as the spring drying occurs, and even earlier, to prevent fires. So that's probably going to affect your park study, graduate student. Yeah,
so interestingly enough, it's been really cool for us to see how much forward thoughtful maintenance for just conditions in parks is, and it's probably because there's so many people out there using them, but certainly clearing underbrush and whatnot, we've come across that as well. I will say that Amy, who's doing that work, she did quantify shrub cover in a lot of parks, not all of them, but a lot of them, And there are some parks that have planted some native shrubs here and there. And I know there's a lot of issues about having shrubs and underbrush in certain parks. But we did notice that in those parks, that's where you'd find the scrub jays, that's where you'd find the California towhees, that's where you'd find some of these birds that likely wouldn't be there otherwise. So absolutely, having those conditions would attract some things. If you remove it, it's gonna kind of take it away. But I know it's very complicated in terms of what you can have in those parks and what the park and rec staff actually has to remove.
So I'm trying, I don't know how many questions you're open for, Eric. We've got, I know that you have.
I'm at home.
Yeah, but you've got an infant child to take care of too. So
luckily I have an awesome wife and she's with our 9-month-old right now. But it's surprising, I miss him already, you know, just giving a talk for an hour or so.
Well, I'm trying to unmute Paula, but she's got me locked. Oh, there we go. She's unmuted.
Okay, good. All right, so those are all the questions we got on chat, which were a lot. And
I think if there's email questions further, we probably are overrunning our time a bit right now. And I'm sure you're open to receiving those questions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we love it. We love having conversations with anyone in the city, whether it's people working for the city or people just living in the city and just interested in these types of questions with talking about this. We are hopefully, and this is just one other kind of aside that I didn't mention earlier, we very much want to start including people in our studies and people's ideas and thoughts and opinions actually as data in our studies, because that's something we didn't do in this first one. This was just like wildlife and trees or birds and trees. And so I do just want to throw it out there that if there's some social scientists or people that know a little bit more about that on the call, I would actually really love to speak with you and talk about ways and developing that line of research, because if we're really going to do this right in terms of thinking of how to manage our urban area for everything, birds and people, we got to include the people side of it as well and their thoughts and opinions and what they want.
All right, should I say something in closing, Marianne?
Please do.
I want to just thank Eric for taking his time today. I'm really so happy that he was able to do this. I know from my chapter, we are all adjusting to what's going on in the world, and it's been a difficult time, but also a kind of an exciting time, because here we are able to include and see people we had not been able to see before or might not have been, and the information is extremely valuable. This is usually the night of our annual end of the year potluck, and I didn't eat, but I feel full because the information fed me and it gave me a lot to think about. And I really, really want to thank you so much for your time, your energy, and I love all that you're doing and you did, and the students. I can't wait to hear about what their work and their results are. It's really great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Paula, and thank you, Richard and Marianne, for hosting me, and thanks everyone for being a part of the call. And as a relatively new resident to LA, I've been here for about 5 years or so, I can say this is my favorite place I've lived, and there's more energy and resources going into thinking about the urban environment than anywhere I've lived. And we should feel proud about that. A lot of work to do, absolutely, but we should all feel inspired and be hopeful.